Hello, welcome to the Raw podcast brought to you by the Sunderland Echo. My name is Jason Jones, joined by Phil Smith. And as the dust is starting to settle, Phil, on Sunderland's triumph at Wembley a week and a half ago, it's fair to say that things are really starting to kick off in the transfer window instead, because these things never ever end, they never ever stop, and they are very much getting underway. Obviously, we're going to be talking about transfers predominantly over the course of this episode, but I think it's fair to say that we're 2 or 3 days into the window and it's already shaping up to be a busy one for Sunderland.
Yeah, it's probably, we were just chatting there, but before we came on to do this, it's probably a bit of a reminder of what life in the Premier League is like. It's probably a little bit of a shock to everyone's system, just the level of scrutiny and attention and discussion that happens. And I suppose there's an excitement to that as well. But yeah, for sure, it feels like it's going to be a long and very busy summer, which, I guess that's the privilege and the luxury of being back in the big time.
Very much so, very much. I mean, obviously, there are a few names that I'm sure we'll sort of come on to and discuss. The big one at the moment, I think the one we've kind of got to start with is Jobe Bellingham. Obviously, lots of rumours surrounding his future on the side at the present moment in time. Various reports from both the continent, closer to home as well, suggesting that Borussia Dortmund have really stepped up their interest in him over the past day or two. I mean, what can you tell us about that? Where does Sunderland currently stand with that? And does his future look as if it's going to be lying away from your side?
Yeah, I think it's starting to look very much like that. I mean, I have to say, from a Sunderland perspective, it's very, very quiet. I think they're determined to kind of keep their counsel on this one. But I think from the conversations that I've been having, I think the timeline events is clearly that Bellingham, I think, as everyone knows, has been weighing up his options and having a bit of a breather at the end of the season. I think that it's fairly obvious to me that a lot of work was done in terms of, I think when Bellingham arrived 2 years ago, I think Sunderland always knew there'd be a scenario like this where top clubs in Europe were circling. I think that this is something that would definitely have happened if Sutton hadn't got promoted. I think Sunderland getting promoted has maybe just added a layer of extra decision making for the player himself in terms of, whether we wanted to make that step up with Sunderland, particularly I think because he's developed some really strong bonds here, and we've all seen that in his celebrations. But it does, certainly Dortmund are of the belief that Bellingham now wants to join them. He appears to have indicated to them that he's prepared to join them, and to the other clubs who are interested that he's made that decision. So now it's just about negotiation, really. From my understanding, there is a release clause of around, I think it works out at about £34 million. Dortmund don't particularly want to pay that. Sunderland want them to pay that. Now, as it usually happens in this, I suspect we'll end up about somewhere in the middle. I think the final fee, if it does get agreed, will probably end up around that level, but potentially is with add-ons and part of it wrapped up in clauses, as is usually the case. So sitting here now, Jason, I'd be really surprised if Bellingham doesn't sign for Dortmund, but of course Sunderland are in a fairly strong position contractually, so they will haggle. Dortmund want this done because they want to take him to the Club World Cup. And obviously this mini transfer window ahead of that Club World Cup shuts on June 10th. So they're really keen to try and get this wrapped up. And I think it's in Sunderland's interests to have a quick resolution because obviously they want to plan for next season. So I think from a Sunderland perspective, although as I say, it's been very quiet at this end, I think it's a case of getting a good deal while also getting a good speedy resolution so they can kind of get on with a very difficult task, let's be honest, of replacing Jobe and getting the squad ready for next season.
I mean, you mentioned the release clause there. Obviously, Sunderland might fall a little bit short of securing that sort of fee. But, say we do fall somewhere between that sort of £34 million mark. There's been 25 million report from other sources. Say we end up somewhere in the middle of that. I mean, do you think that would be a fee that Sunderland could be satisfied with? And do you think that would represent good value for Sunderland?
I think it does. I think especially when you put it in the context of much of Bellingham's younger development was obviously at Birmingham, not at Sunderland. Now, obviously, the exact fee that Sunderland paid to sign Bellingham, we don't know, and we'll never entirely know. But we think with add-ons, etc., probably around 3 million. So I think if you're potentially making 10 times the money that you signed him for 2 years ago, and he's played an integral part in getting you promoted to the Premier League and all the riches that brings, I think you just have to look at it and say, you know what, this has worked out for everybody. Well done, and shake hands. I think the nice thing for me is that when you look at it in that context, in terms of he's come to Sunderland 2 years, moves on, you know, to Dortmund, feels all quite pre-planned. You could be quite cynical about it. And I think what's quite nice about this one is the fact that Bellingham has actually left a real impression because, you know, he really bought into the club. You know, he really, you know, he stuck with the club when he could have sort of tried to go last year when things were all a little bit up in the air. And I think he's developed a real connection with the fan base and the club and his teammates. So I think that's a nice thing about this, is that it's one where, yes, he moves on relatively quickly, but he's actually sort of written a little chapter in the club's history. And I think that's a really, really nice thing. So for me, like, it is a negative because Sunderland are losing one of the players who you kind of hanging your hat on and saying, I'm pretty sure he could step up next season. And that's obviously leaves a big hole in the squad. But I don't think you can argue this is bad business. I think this puts, you know, Sunderland in a good position heading into the summer window. And I think crucially, if they did get somewhere in the kind of fee that we're mentioning, it puts them in such a strong position if other clubs come in for other players in their squad as well. And I think that's something to consider as well, that like Sunderland weren't under massive pressure to sell before this. They're under absolute zero pressure to sell if it does happen. So I think there's a lot, although there's a sadness to it, I think you have to be honest and say from a business perspective, like, this deal will make a lot of sense if and when it happens.
I think the other thing as well there, you're talking about the pressure that Sunderland would sort of alleviate a little bit if the sale were to go through. Obviously, Watson's already gone. You know, Tommy Watson's moved to Brighton, as we already knew it would be, but that was confirmed. Was it earlier this week, late last week, whenever it might have been? You know, so that's another £10 million that Sunderland have already pocketed. You know, and there is also an element here of, it's something that we've said a few times, isn't it? But one of the big selling points of Sunderland as a club for these young talents who've been coming through the door over the course of the past 3-4 seasons, whatever it might have been, is that they're not necessarily going to stand in the way of that next almost inevitable career step. You know, when you look at a player of Jobe Bellingham's quality, it's felt for a long time as if he was destined to take that same step in the way that his brother did, and sort of try his luck at the sort of next level of European football that someone just can't offer him at this present moment in time. And, you know, when you take those two things into combination, obviously the Watson sale, and then the fact that, you know, Sunderland are sort of a club that's set up in a way that's sort of willing to allow their players to take those steps, you know, it kind of feels to me, at least, as if this is a deal that you know, wouldn't necessarily be anything that someone would look on particularly negatively, if you know what I mean.
No, I don't think so. And I think that what you allude to there is a really important point. Now, of course, there's a balance and a fine line where you've got to put the club first and you've got to protect the club's interests. And that is the job of the sporting director and the recruitment team and the owner. But I think one thing I would say is that if Sunderland had a reputation for, as you put it, standing in players' way, Jobe Bellingham would never have signed for Sunderland 2 years ago. One of the reasons he signed for Sunderland was when he could have, I would have strongly imagined, had the pick of a number of clubs in Europe, was that A, they were going to play him straight away, which obviously wouldn't have happened if he'd gone to a top Premier League academy, in the first team, I mean. And the second thing is that, like, he wouldn't have signed a contract extension last summer if he thought that meant Sunderland were going to hold it against him a year down the line. Like, he wouldn't have, would he? Because if Sunderland had a reputation for, we will block your path to the very top when the opportunity comes around, then players just wouldn't sign. Like, players like Chris Rigg wouldn't be signing their professional contracts here if they thought they meant it was going to tie them to the club. The only reason you can get players who have all these options to come and play for you is to give them a pathway and to show that when the timing's right, you let them move on. Now, that doesn't mean being a soft touch. Like, I always use the example when Burnley came in for Jack Clark, it'll be 2 summers ago now. You know, someone rejected those bids because they didn't feel it met their valuation. But it meant that a year later, when another Premier League came in and the bids were about twice the number, they did feel that realistically they kind of had to let Clark take that opportunity to go to the Premier League. So it is a really fine balance, and you don't want to give the impression that someone should just sell players, you know, the first time a bid comes in. But that's not what happens. But I think it's, if you are going to commit to this model, and so far it's been working for Sunderland, I think you do have to be brave in identifying the point at which you have to say to players, okay, yeah, you know, fair enough. This is an opportunity that we can't stand in the way of. You know, the key thing is getting a good fee. In this circumstance, it looks like, although there's obviously a little bit to run in terms of negotiations, it looks like that's something they'll manage.
Absolutely. And I mean, obviously, from a Sunderland perspective, I was going to say the only downside, obviously, it's a massive downside, and it's one you've already alluded to, but trying to replace Bellingham is not going to be an easy
Yeah.
thing if it comes to that. Do you know what I mean? Because I think we've seen over the course of, obviously, his time at Sunderland writ large, but certainly his time under Regis Lebris this past season and the role that he's played in that Sunderland midfield. I mean, so many naysayers, so many doubters who perhaps suggested that he is very much, living off the Bellingham name. I think all of those doubts, anybody who's watched him on a weekly basis would have to argue that they've been entirely dispelled. He's obviously a very, very promising talent, but one as well who's so integral to the way that Sunderland plays, was also so well rounded. I think it's fair to say, like at such a young age, he operates with a maturity that I think sort of belies his age a little bit. He's good on the front foot. He battles so tremendously well in the heart of midfield. His passing's good. He's got a good range of distribution. I mean, it's not necessarily going to be easy for someone to bring in a player of that quality straight off the bat, is it, Phil?
I don't think so. And I think you related to it there, like when you're on social media and stuff, you can tell straight away that someone's just not serious in their analysis. I haven't watched him much. They either say it's only because of his surname, or they mention goals and assists. And I think while he's been playing, like, is basically at times he's played as the holding midfielder this year, albeit not very often. So I think, like, his athleticism, the way he can go from box to box, the way he can sort of wriggle out of trouble and move the ball quickly out wide to launch counter attacks. Everyone who's watched him this season can see that he's a huge talent for his age and that he's going to have a good career. And I think that in the games he was absent, that someone missed him. I don't have the stats to hand in terms of the record when he wasn't in the team last year, but I would imagine there was a drop off in Sunderland's performances because they didn't really have another midfielder like him. Got lots of excellent midfielders at the club, but certainly that physical dominance that he was able to exert at times last season and that sort of running power to go from box to box, I think is something that Sunderland really missed. And we didn't see it as much last year, but he has got an eye for goal. I mean, we all remember when he was stuck up front against Cardiff and he scored twice, didn't he? He has got that as well, and that's an invaluable quality, really. So I think he is going to be a difficult player to replace. It would have been much harder to do it if we were still in the Championship for budgetary reasons. I think that's the one positive you can take from this situation, that, Sunderland are now heading into the transfer window, in my opinion, with a slightly scary amount of work to do. There's no point sort of hiding away from that, but also financially, if this deal does go through, they're going to be in a really, really good position to invest in some young talent.
I suppose the other thing to mention as well is that obviously there is a certain Enzo Lefebvre kicking about who we're not expecting to go anywhere now that Sunderland have been promoted. And while I think the sort of general feeling on Weir's side when he first arrived was that he would operate as the sort of most advanced of Lebris's midfield three, I think it's probably fair to say that thus far, at least during his Sunderland career, he's probably looked more comfortable in a central role when he's been operating that little bit deeper. It's not necessarily the case that he is only number 10. And maybe, and again, your opinion on this, but perhaps there's a version of this in which Sunderland don't necessarily feel the need to go out and buy a direct Bellingham replacement because Lefebvre is capable of operating in more positions than we might have initially assumed he could.
Yeah, I think this is something we spoke to Lebris about sort of in the early weeks after Lefebvre arrived. In terms of, I think when he was younger, he was very, very much number 10. But I think once at Lorient, when he started to play as more of an 8 and started to get a bit deeper, it was something he was really reluctant to then move back away from because he was getting so much more of the ball and he was able to have so many more touches that I think that was something he really relished. So I certainly think Lefebvre would love to play as a bit more of an 8 and be able to come a little bit deeper and get on the ball loads and dictate the pace of the game. So I agree with that. But I do think that Bellingham, in terms of the ground he's able to cover over and over again, the amount of duels he wins, and also the amount of headers he wins, like he's quite a big part of that for Sunderland. I think that will leave a big gap if we're just talking about the players who are contracted in terms of like Neil, Rig, Lefebvre, 3 players who I absolutely adore, but physically in the Premier League, there is obviously a gap there that what Bellingham's been able to do over the last year or so can kind of help you deal with. So I do think they will have to get the balance right in that midfield, and I think they will need a bit more athleticism if Bellingham goes. But I certainly agree with you in terms of, I think Lefebvre will be. I don't think it's just like, Lefebvre's at 10 and we build around that. I definitely think he'll be in the conversation to play deeper at times this season. But you've got to get the right players around him, haven't you? Especially when, if we're being realistic, like Sunderland aren't going to be having 70% of the ball in many games next year, so they're definitely going to have to think about that as well.
I mean, you say that, you never know, man. You never know. Obviously, you mentioned.
Yeah, you're right.
Daniel.
That's very negative of me, Jason. That's very negative of me. You're right to call it out on.
We all start on 0 points, Phil. We all start on 0 points.
Quite right.
Obviously, you mentioned Daniel there. Slightly precarious situation, isn't it? In the sense that his contract is out next summer. Obviously, there have been these rumours as well. AS Roma supposedly looking at him. They've been mentioned before. Those reports have sort of resurfaced in recent days. I mean, I'm just sort of, again, interested to get your thoughts on this and how concerned you are about the prospect of Dan Neil potentially leaving Sunderland this summer.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, obviously a bit concerned because he only has 1 year left on his contract, and I think that obviously puts Sunderland in a bit of a vulnerable position if he decides not to sign another one. It's not one that I'm losing a huge amount of sleep over yet, just as in I think it's a little bit early in the summer to be worried about the contractual situation one way or another. And what I mean by that is I spoke to Dan after the comeback win over Swansea in December, I think it was. Yeah, December. And he sort of said then, like, look, like, I'm just focused on promotion. And then when I spoke to Christian Speakman in February, he kind of said the same thing, like, we've had some conversations, but it's not the right time. Let's just focus on winning promotion. And I think that was sensible, and I think it made sense. If Sunderland hadn't gone up, I think Daniel would have had top-tier offers, and I think would have had a decision to make. Dan's obviously, like all the other players, has had a break at the end of the season, and rightly so, because that was deserved. So I'd be surprised if any significant conversations had really happened yet on that front. So I'm not particularly concerned that we haven't had like a major update on the contractual front. I think Sunderland have got a good chance of getting a new contract for Daniel Sort, because I think his preference will be to play for Sunderland in the Premier League. He's been such a big part of this journey, and I imagine that that's what they want to go and do. Obviously, when you see names like AS Roma linked, we're talking about a prestige and a potential like life opportunity, really, that will leave him with a difficult decision. But of all the other players in the squad, Dan Neil is the one I'm most worried about because of his contractual situation. I think that's the easiest way to put it. But I don't think it's time to quite panic yet, because I think, I think there will still be an element of goodwill on both sides there that makes you think an agreement could be reached. But outside of Jobe, who I think now is increasingly likely to leave, clearly Dan would be the one you'd be most concerned about, because that's the only position where, Sunderland aren't really in a position where they can say, actually, no, we're not prepared to do that in this window.
I think, obviously, again, you sort of alluded to it there. As a Sunderland fan, you would at least like to think that it weighs in Sunderland's favour, the potential to be able to offer Dan Neil the opportunity to captain his boyhood club in the Premier League. That's, again, not to say that one thing will happen, one thing won't happen, but at the very least, you would imagine that would make any decision over leaving the club a damn sight harder than it would have been if Sunderland were, still in the Championship this season.
Yeah, definitely. And Dan's never played at the Premier League before either. So, I think it's potentially a really good opportunity for him to go and test himself at that level. And then, I think for me, like, there'll be a lot of players where, I think it makes sense for them to step up with Sunderland and to test themselves on that level and to try and establish Sunderland at that level. It's kind of the last part of the job, right? In terms of if we look at the journey that the club's been on in the last few years. And I think there'll be a real determination. I honestly do think there'll be a real determination within that dressing room from the core of the players who've been on that journey to go and finish the job and to establish his club in the Premier League. As I say, like, you have to balance against what other opportunities will be out there. And if we are talking about, a team that will be hoping to challenge for the Champions League places in Serie A next year and an amazing life opportunity, then that will be a difficult decision. But I think it's in the way that, like, it feels like the Jobe thing is happening now. I think it's way too early to be talking about that with Dan Neil. I think there's still a lot of conversations to be had, and I would at this stage remain, fairly hopeful and optimistic that there's something can still be solved on that in the next few weeks.
Another name who we've seen linked with, interest from outside, Trai Hume, Sky Sports suggesting that is it what, Everton, Wolves, and a couple of La Liga clubs thrown in there for good measure as well. I mean, obviously, wonderfully important player for Sunderland over the past couple of years, really, really top performer in the Championship, and a player who I think one way or another, most people would agree is definitely deserving of a shot in the Premier League. Really excited to see how he gets on in the top flight next season. I mean, again, you sort of mentioned it there, but given the fact that his contract is a little bit more secure than Neil's, I mean, is that one that you're less concerned about?
I think so. Yeah, I mean, I think like it's something we're starting to get a little bit more used to now. That I think like at the start and the end of every transfer window, every Sunderland player gets linked with a move away. Like it's just it just seems to be the way of things now, and that's a compliment to Sunderland because it means they've got stacks of brilliant young players who other teams want to sign. But we have enough windows now under this current regime to know that there's not going to be a fire sale. Like there's been interest in players across every single window, and at most one is left. You know, and in most of those situations, it has been when the contractual situation is largely forced the club's hands. Certainly the case in Stuart Watson and Clark. So I don't have the sort of inside track on where Trai Hume's head's at, whether he wants to leave. I've watched him play for the last year, and I think it's incredibly obvious how much he absolutely loves the club and how determined he would be to try and establish it at Premier League level. I do think he's probably in line for a new contract. I mean, he signed his last new deal 2 years ago, and I think we can all agree he's miles ahead of where he was then as a player. I'm sure that promotion means that there's sort of an automatic increase in his wages and stuff, but I definitely think he's someone who deserves to sort of be rewarded for the progress he's made. But these kinds of players, especially now that Jobe's going, I'm a bit more relaxed about because Sunderland just are under no pressure to sell. And the model isn't to sell players as soon as a big bid comes in for them. Sunderland could have sold all these players well before now if they'd wanted to, if it was about turning a quick profit. They'll be determined to keep the rest of the team together, especially if Jobe does go. So, you don't have a crystal ball, you can't see far into the future, but I'm quite relaxed about these kind of ones because I'm just looking at what's happened in previous windows where we've been through the same thing. And actually the turnover's been much, much smaller by the end of it. So for sure, I envisage Jobe leaving, maybe, one or two others over the course of the window, but there isn't going to be a fire sale. There just isn't. There never is.
Should we talk about some potential incomings rather than sort of, spending half an hour doom and glooming about potential, players who are going to leave Sunderland over the next few weeks? So I mean, we've seen reports in the past few days, haven't we, that Sunderland are potentially going to look at prioritising new fullbacks, new wingers, sort of strengthening the squad in those positions. I mean, does that feel right to you? Do you sort of look at the players at Bruce's disposal at the moment and think, yeah, they need a bit more strength in those areas?
I think so, because I think that wingers was an option where we felt light in the second half of last season, and that was obviously before Tommy Watson left. It would take a quite remarkable turnaround in fortunes for Jan Paveda, in my eyes, to emerge as someone who Régis Lebris had as part of his Premier League squad next season. So you're essentially looking at it, you're basically going into next season with Mundle and Roberts. Mundle obviously has had some hamstring issues this season. Mundle and Roberts are two players that I would want as part of my Premier League squad. Absolutely no debate about it. But, wingers are a really important position, A, because of the way Sunderland play, and B, because it's a position where you need to be able to change later in games to get a bit more freshness to kind of run at tired defenders. So for me, I think you need two wingers. And in my opinion, that's an absolute priority for me going into this window. Again, absolutely not a reflection on Mundle and Roberts, who I would have in my squad any day of the week. I think they're excellent. And I think Roberts is someone who will just get better the more you put good players in the team with him. And I'm excited to see how he develops next season in terms of that. So wingers is a big priority for me. And I think fullbacks, again, is an important position because similar to Roberts and Mundle, you have Hume and Serkin, both players who I think are capable of stepping up and deserve the opportunity to step up. But as we've seen this season, you're an injury or two away from having to put players out of position, and it's going to be really difficult to get away with doing that in the Premier League. And of course, Serkin is someone who, like Adji Elise, who would ordinarily be an option. Those two players have both had injury issues in the past. So I think that feels about right to me in terms of two really important positions. As I say, not because of a reflection of the players who've played there most of the season, but I think there are areas where you'd quickly become incredibly vulnerable at Premier League level if you suffered injuries. So it's one of those, like, you could make a case for strengthening every position on the pitch because you're stepping up to the Premier League. But I think if I'm looking at areas where it's really, really important that you add some proven quality, there are definitely two positions that stand out to me. Obviously, the centre midfield one's a little bit more complex, isn't it? Because we need to know who's staying first before we have a sense of where needs to be strengthened. And I do think you need a third striker. I think that's really important as well. We were probably lucky that Meandra and Isidore didn't get injured in the second half of this season. They're both players, again, who I would have in my squad next year absolutely every day of the week. But I think you need a third. So those are probably the positions that sitting here now are kind of screaming at me.
You mentioned the centre midfield and you mentioned the point of attack as well. I just want to run a couple of names by you that we have already seen sort of linked, half linked, if you like. Obviously, the first one, Jordan Henderson. It's a story that has been doing the rounds for a while. It's a story that does not seem to be going anywhere. I mean, sort of taking out the equation, whether it will happen or not, do you think that he would be a good addition to this Sunderland squad?
Yeah, I think Sunderland need a bit of Premier League experience. I think that's definitely one thing. I don't have a problem with them sticking to the model that they've sort of implemented over the last few years. But even when you think of like the team that did well in the first season in the Championship, it had Danny Bart, Alex Pritchard. It had that little smattering of players who knew the level. And so I think that's going to be important again going into the Premier League. And I think it is important that you add some more leadership into that dressing room because it's potentially going to be tricky next season at times. There are going to be moments where it might feel really, really difficult, where you might be on a really poor run. Players who can handle that and know how to drag other players with them are going to be really important. Really hard for me to make a comment on what level Henderson is at the moment because as much as I would love to, I don't watch much Eredivisie, so I'm not really sure where his game's at. If it's the Henderson that we watched, of years gone by, then of course he would add a massive amount to the midfield. I get the impression that it's something that would be welcomed by the vast majority of Sunderland fans from sort of the initial feedback I can see. As we talked about going into the January window on this podcast, it's not quite the home run that it once would have been in terms of the mood because of that, very controversial move to Saudi Arabia, and we talked about that at length at the time. So it's probably not quite the home run that it once would have been. But I certainly think he would add a lot on the pitch and in the dressing room. I don't think there's any doubt about that.
I think it was Marco Gabbiadini made the point on Total Sport the other night, and he was like you and like me as well. He says I don't see a lot of the Dutch top flight, but he must be doing something right. If Thomas Tuchel has felt the need to bring him back into that England squad, obviously leadership credentials, fair enough, but on a footballing level, he must still have enough about him to be a worthwhile addition. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and Ajax, I think they blew the title in the end, didn't they? But they were leading the Eredivisie for much of the season. So he clearly, to be part of that team, he's clearly still performing at a decent level. And in fact, Monaco tried to sign him in January, wasn't there? There was a lot of controversy around that. So again, he's clearly performing at a level where he still has a lot of ability. So I don't think there's any doubt about that. It'll be about what options he has, both financially and from a sporting perspective. And as I say, it would be interesting whether the controversy over his move when he left Liverpool would have an impact in Sunderland's decision making. Because as I say, whereas once we'd have been looked at it going, it's kind of the feel good football story of the year. I do think a lot of people would still see it that way, but it's not everybody would either. My feeling is that wouldn't impact Sunderland's thinking. They've played a friendly against the Saudi Arabian team in the past. I suspect that it wouldn't impact their thinking, but it would certainly influence some people's views on it, I think, to be fair.
And then finally, one last one, Phil. Obviously, you mentioned the need for a third striker. We've seen suggestions that Sunderland might be willing to reopen talks with Liverpool over the prospect of bringing Jadon Danns back for a second loan stint. Obviously, a bit of a misnomer that in the sense that he hasn't actually played for the club despite signing on deadline day in January. I mean, it's a weird one, this, isn't it? Because it's hard to sort of get a read on a player who we've never seen in red and white. But is there perhaps a feeling that, if Sunderland are going to go and get a third striker, that they given that they're a Premier League team now, should they be aiming for a little bit more than a player like a Jayden Danns, or do you think that he deserves an opportunity to prove himself in the Premier League, given his pedigree with Liverpool?
Yeah, my feeling on the Jayden Danns one is that because, as you just said, we've never seen him play. Again, quite difficult to make a judgment on his level. But listen, my feeling is that if I was in someone's perspective, I would want a striker with a bit more top tier experience, because you have a huge, prodigious talent of your own in Eliza Mayenda, who you'll want to get minutes. You have Wilson Isidore, who I know his form dipped towards the end of the season, but who I think has a lot to offer, but doesn't have a lot of Premier League experience. I would definitely be wanting somebody a little bit more established to come in. It is really difficult because, especially with young players of Jayden Danns' reputation, you don't know how quickly they can develop, and maybe it could be a huge success in the Premier League. My view sitting here is that if Sunderland had won promotion, I think he would have been one of their top summer targets. And I think that maintaining a really good relationship with Liverpool around the deal over the last few months, I think a big part of that was to potentially be at the front of the queue if Danns was to go out on loan again this summer. And I think if Sunderland had been a Championship club, for me, that would have been a complete no-brainer. I think it would be risky to kind of wait for Jayden Danns, because I imagine Liverpool will keep him in their squad for pre-season. They'll want to take a close look at him. For me, Sunderland need to be getting on with their business, and they need to be looking at trying to recruit another striker before then. So sitting here right now, like, it's not one that I can personally see, but it's difficult to see how it will develop later in the summer. But for me, I think that's one that would have been much more likely if Sunderland hadn't won promotion. I think Sunderland have to look at it a little bit differently now they're going into the top tier. But, you know, as we always say, it's a very, very long summer, and things can change super quickly.
Absolutely, it certainly is. Should we call it there? That's all we've got time for in this week's show. Join us again next week when we'll be discussing all the latest Sunderland news and developments. In the meantime, follow all the latest Black Cats news on the Sunderland Echo. You can give us a follow on social media as well. Thanks to Phil. Thanks to you for listening. We'll see you next time.